All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you had a great time checking in with everyone. And we're so happy to have you here this morning for Sunday Morning Zen. In the chat box, I've put our Donna link to zlmc.org/donate. And if programs like this, Sunday Morning Zen, Commit to Sit, or even things like in-person meditation and bonfire night are meaningful to you, we'd appreciate your help in making these parts of our mission possible. It all depends on you, and if it's as important to you as it is to us, we'd appreciate your help in lining these events up by your generous donations. This morning we have our abbot and co-founder Roshi Robert Althouse speaking to us, and he really doesn't need much of an invitation, but he has a fresh way of presenting Zen that makes the rich teachings of the tradition available to everyone, and we're excited to have him. It's always wonderful when he speaks, and he'll be speaking to us this morning about the grace process. So I'll turn it over to you, Roshi.
Okay. Whoops, I was trying to getting confused by the technology here. Just a minute. Get it together. Good morning, everyone. So happy to see you all, and very happy to be able to share the Dharma with you this morning, especially why I want to talk about compassion, and I want to talk about the grace process. I'll be doing a workshop on the grace process next week on Saturday if you want to learn more about it. But first of all, I'd just like to talk about compassion, because I think we have a lot of misconceptions about what compassion is. And I think in general in our culture, we don't appreciate how important compassion is. We have many, obviously, I don't have to tell you the kind of challenges we are facing now on so many levels. There's a recent Washington Post Kaiser Family Foundation poll that found that 3 in 10 healthcare workers are considering leaving their profession. And more than half of them are burnt out, and roughly 6 in 10 say that stress from the pandemic has significantly harmed their mental and physical health, well-being. We're very fond of raising our healthcare workers up as heroes, and I think they often resent that, especially when they're on the front lines, and many are still refusing to wear masks and practice social distancing following the guidelines of the CDC. So I'd like to first of all, we know that there's a large amount of burnout in the healthcare field and other fields as well. So first of all, I'd just like to make a distinction between stress and burnout, because we all feel levels of stress. Stress is too much. You have too many responsibilities, and in many ways, stress is a sign of living a meaningful life. It's not all bad, but chronic stress is not great either. But burnout is different. Stress is too much. Burnout is not enough. And when we experience stress, we are usually aware of it. But when we experience burnout, we most likely don't even know that we're burnt out. So when we're burnt out, we feel empty and mentally exhausted, devoid of motivation and beyond caring. It's really a state of depression, and hope for positive change in the future doesn't seem possible. That's burnout. And the reason why I'm offering the grace process is a process that Roshi Joan Halifax discovered and has brought into the world. And I think it's a brilliant way to talk about how to facilitate compassion in our relationships, and as a result, help us be more resilient and less likely to burn out. But first of all, I think we need to understand what compassion is and what it isn't. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi said that life is like stepping onto a boat which is about to sail out to sea and sink. So what's hope good for? We're all sailing on the Titanic. And yet hope doesn't seem to serve us, because hope is just the other side of the coin of fear. And when we are hoping for something, we are expecting some outcome. And very often that hope leads to fear of not achieving that outcome. So Joan Halifax Roshi speaks about wise hope. Joanne Macy speaks about active hope. It is possible to have hope. Wise hope is showing up. We never know what kind of seeds we can plant. Even if the world seems to be coming to an end, it might not. We don't know. So so we need to learn more about wise hope, or how wisdom functions in the world, which is really what compassion is. I think we have misunderstandings about compassion. First of all, I think it just gets discounted in the culture at large. People think compassion is squishy and weak. It's like something new age, like singing Kumbaya or hugging trees or something silly. People may think compassion is depressing. And then we have what even gets more difficult is, how do we, if we see that compassion actually is not that, the compassion is a moral virtue. And I think almost every world religion speaks about compassion in one way or another as a really important spiritual experience. It's important for our humanity. So what are some of the qualities of compassion? Some of the virtues that come with compassion? I think one is kindness or tenderness. We have this sad, Chogyam Trungpa speaks about our sad and tender heart. This is, in our tradition, we call this bodhicitta. We have this sad and tender, we have this soft spot, and we so often wall it over and guard against it, trying to hold everything together. And because to have a sad and tender heart is to be vulnerable, is to be open to the uncertainty of the world, is to be open to impermanence, is to know the reality of impermanence. Another quality of compassion, I think, is curiosity, a kind of open heart, a willingness to show up, a willingness to be present in whatever the situation is, without our assumptions, without our interpretation, without our judgment. I think compassion includes empathy, although empathy by itself is not compassion. Forgiveness has to do with compassion. Opening the heart has to do very much with compassion. Beauty has something to do with compassion. Beauty. One of the core values of our Zen Center, if you look on our website, you can read it. I'll read it here. The core value of our Zen Center is to create and appreciate beauty. This is beauty in the sense of seeing the beauty in another, not just what needs to be fixed. Compassion is not utilitarian. So that's why in a materialistic culture as we live in, it's easy to discount how important compassion is, how important it is, really. Compassion changes how we think about what is possible. It's rarely a solution that points to an answer, but it points to a deeper reality, a deeper human possibility and potential in each of us. There's a story in the Jewish tradition about the creation, which is a lovely, lovely story. It's called Tikkun Olam. And as the story goes, at the beginning of creation, something happened. And the original light of the universe was shattered into many pieces. And each of those pieces lodged in some aspect, in every aspect of creation. And in the Jewish tradition, one of the highest human callings is to look for that light, to point at it when you see it, to gather it up in this way, to repair the world. Each of us, no matter how flawed and inadequate we may feel, no matter how difficult these dark times seem, we have the potential to make a difference with what we can see and touch. And that's wise hope. And that's essentially the Bodhisattva vow that we take, that is at the heart of our spiritual practice. We take this vow to save all sentient beings. An impossible vow, but we take it. And it is what orients our life, is to live our life for the sake of relieving the suffering of others, not just the people we know in our family or even our tribe, but everyone, universal, a universal vow of compassion. Now, here's the problem with compassion, I think. First of all, the problems are the misunderstandings and the not appreciating it. The other one is often the way religions talk about compassion. You should be more compassionate. And then, you tell you a story about Mother Teresa. Oh my gosh. Okay, so you hear heroic stories about great spiritual beings like Mother Teresa, and you feel completely demolished and inadequate. Well, I can't be like that. I guess compassion is for saints. But how about us, ordinary mortals? How do we bring compassion into our lives? And I think the religious moralizing about compassion is not helpful. It's actually disempowering. Now, here's the brilliance of the grace process that Joan has brought into the world, which I think is really an important, we would call it an upaya in our tradition, a skillful means. I would go so far as to say it's a spiritual technology. That sounds a little techie, but what I mean is that it is an actual way to put together a series of processes that we can experience that make it more likely that compassion will emerge in our relationships. And here's what's really revolutionary, I think, about Roshi Jones' teaching here, is that compassion actually consists of non-compassionate elements. So when you try to be compassionate by being more compassionate, it doesn't really work. It's not specific, it's not precise enough. We need to be very precise here. And Joan has something called the Abide model, which supports this process. So there are things that we know we can strengthen through meditation. Whether we can prove them through neuroscience is questionable. A lot of neuroscience is in the early stages of studying meditation and contemplative practices. But I think we could probably all agree from our own personal experience, if you're a meditator, and there's some neuroscience that supports this to some degree, that meditation improves the quality of our attention, which is really important. And one thing that we could say from the point of view of neuroscience about our attention that has all kinds of implications for a spiritual path of the Bodhisattva or of being compassionate is that we know that we have what's called a default mode in the brain. Right here. And this default mode is active when we're doing nothing. And what the default mode consists of, for the most part, is thoughts about me and mine. Me and mine, how many clicks I'm getting on Facebook. It's a self-referential awareness that we all experience every day. I think if you're honest, we all have this voice in our head. And the more we're distracted, the more that we don't pay attention, the stronger that default mode is. And that is really the root of what in our tradition we would call the construction of ego or self. So what they know in neuroscience, and this at first when they discovered it, it was kind of shocking because they couldn't understand it. What they found was that when the brain is at rest, the default mode is most active. It's taking up a lot of oxygen and energy in the brain. But when you focus on a task, that attention, that self-referential, constant referring to oneself dies down. So one of the geniuses of traditional Zen practice, if you're in a monastery, is that you're kept busy all day long, sweeping, cleaning, cooking, cutting vegetables. You don't have time to think about yourself. Now, that's a great way to train, but most of us aren't living in monasteries. But my point here is that we can, and it's really important, and I think we might be getting a little sloppy because we're on Zoom a lot, is it's really important to appreciate that we are, we're not great scholars or neuroscientists. We're just humble practitioners of the Buddha way, each of us. And practice means to pay attention. To pay attention. And as we teach in the foundation courses, the most important practice, the foundational practice, is what we call shamatha, one-pointed attention, counting the breath. And that in one way or another, you come back to it. I find myself coming back to it quite a lot now, especially when I'm sitting in front of a computer, because I find the computer distracting. And if I'm looking at myself, I'm also stimulating my default mode more. So I try to turn off looking at myself as much as possible so I can look at you instead. But for those of us who are long-term practitioners, when you're sitting in the Zendo and practicing meditation, usually this quality of attention doesn't require as much effort as it does in the beginning. You begin to internalize it and it becomes second nature, what we might call a trait. So that you're able to pay attention not only on the meditation cushion, but in your daily life, and that's important. So my point here is that what I'm finding as a long-time practitioner is I have to actually apply more effort to pay attention when I meditate. with you and commit to sit. And I think it's easy to get sloppy with Zoom at this point, and we should kind of redouble our efforts to count the breath. Just do a simple counting the breath practice. And in other words, you're coming back. So the point here is that we can improve the quality of our attention through meditation practice. We all have this experience. We also know that we can increase our capacity for empathy. And when we move into doing a kind of Vipassana practice, which means penetrating insight, we also know that we can begin to have a quality of wisdom that has insight into the nature of how things actually are here. And the other aspect of our practice, I think you experience it non-verbally, so it's hard to talk about. But if you've ever sat for any length of time, you feel the embodiment taking place as the samadhi gets stronger in your practice, and you kind of sink into it. You feel that embodiment. All these aspects that are part of meditation practice are aspects of the grace process. In other words, what Joan discovered, and is that first of all, compassion doesn't necessarily improve from sitting meditation. There's some evidence it improves from doing meta-awareness practice like loving kindness. It probably also is improved by doing something like Tonglen. But those are practices that are long-term trait changes in people that do these practices more or less for a long period of time. So the point here is that we might be able to bring ourselves to attention fairly quickly by just paying attention. Right now, pay attention. But you can't necessarily just bring yourself to compassion in the same way. Okay, let's all be compassionate right now. What does that mean? How do we do that? That just feels like a lot of pressure, and it's so easy to feel guilty. Well, I'm not that compassionate, or I'm not feeling that compassionate at the moment. I'm feeling kind of grumpy or something, or irritable. So the point here is that what Joan is saying, and there's other neuroscientists that have spoken about this quite as well, is that compassion is an emergent process. It emerges in relationship to others in our life, in our lived experience. And then the question is, what are those experiences that we can manage and regulate that make it more likely that compassion will emerge in those relationships? And that's essentially what the grace process is about. Is this making sense so far? Anyone have a question about what I've said so far, or a thought? Anything? Okay. So the grace process is an acronym that stands for a series of steps that you can put together that make it more likely that compassion arises. And it's built on something that Joan Halifax Roshi calls the Abide model. But the grace stands for, the G stands for gather your attention, gather your awareness. If you're already a meditation practitioner, this will not be a particularly challenging thing to do. You just bring yourself to attention. But the beauty of this model is that you do not, it certainly helps to be a meditator, but you don't have to be. And we can teach very simple ways to pay attention to the body or the breath or the feet or sensations to quickly just bring yourself to attention. It might be as simple as just pausing if you're going along, speeding along, just taking a moment to pause. And then the second step of R means to remember your intention. And again, we know that from mindfulness practice, we can cultivate intention and our motivation. That's something we can actually work on. We say mindfulness is an intentional awareness. It doesn't happen haphazardly. You have to intend to pay attention. So intention becomes a huge part of making it more likely that compassion is going to arise. You remember your intention, your motivation for why you're doing what you're doing, if you're working with a difficult teenager, you remember why you became a parent in the first place. If you're a doctor or a nurse working in a hospital and you're having a really hard day, this would be remembering why you became a nurse. And you might be feeling kind of jaded and disappointed and dispirited from working in a dysfunctional system. So remembering your intention is really important. And we can come back and talk about this more because it's really, really critical for staying grounded and not being what we call upregulated or triggered. And then the middle process of grace stands for attune to self and other. You attune to yourself, and then you attune to the other. And this often doesn't happen when we're rushing into a relationship to work with somebody. First, you attune to three things. First, you attune to your embodied awareness, which is nonverbal. And again, it's very hard for many to trust that because we're a very verbal culture. But again, if you have a meditation practice, it's easier, or a yoga practice, or you're working with the body, you notice what is your embodied body telling you? What kind of feedback are you getting from your body? You have butterflies in your stomach? What? And then what's your emotional, what are you feeling? What emotion is coming up for you in the moment? And then the third thing you would attune to is your cognitive information. What story are you telling yourself? And you can do this quite quickly if you practice it and train in it. And then you do the same thing for the other person. You look at their body language. What might they be experiencing in their embodied experience? What might they be feeling? You're guessing. But you can tell a lot from someone's body language if you're really listening and paying attention. What is their story? What story are they telling themselves? And that's the middle process of grace. And then the next one, the C, stands for consider what will serve, given your training as a parent, as a first responder, as a policeman, as a nurse, as a doctor. What tools do you have that are going to help in this moment with this person? What can you do that will be helpful to them? What will be helpful to their family, perhaps? And then the E stands for engage. Now you engage. And it also you do what needs to be done. You totally are engaged in a conversation, listening, receiving, speaking, whatever. And then E also stands for end, which is really important. You've got to close the door. You have to have closure so that you can go on to the next thing. So that's the grace process. And it sounds, let me give you an example of how this might work for a nurse in a busy hospital. A nurse working in a hospital that's dysfunctional, a for-profit system. It's already dysfunctional because it's for-profit. And it's very common now, unfortunately. In a healthcare system, which is the most expensive in the world, that is so complicated, even doctors don't know what's going on half the time. And certainly we don't know. And now let's just imagine a morning for a nurse during the pandemic. when there's all this fear and stress in the air, there's people dying in the hospital, and she has to see, she has to see 15 people in the course of the morning. So realistically speaking, she has 15 minutes to be with a patient. Okay, that's it. She doesn't have time to spend any more time than that. She goes in, the first patient is a 5-year-old that has cancer. Okay. Now, if she doesn't practice something like the grace process, and she might already do something like that intuitively, but if she doesn't, it's easy to imagine she's under pressure, time pressure. She doesn't have a lot of time to be reflective here. So she's rushing into that room. The parents are in there, they want to see her. Maybe she's running a couple minutes late. She rushes into the room and runs right into the situation with the patient without ever stopping to have any awareness of what's going on for her. Do you see how that could be? And you see how that could lead to being to burnout, because when you go missing, you're missing a huge chunk of what sustains you as a human being. So this process of attuning to self and other is really critically important. And the quality of attention is important, because we all know we can easily be distracted. So if the nurse was practicing something like the grace process, perhaps she would pause before she opened the door. Just pause, notice her breathing, how her feet are making contact with the floor. Remember her intention, and this can be done really quickly, in a minute. Remember her intention. Why did she become a nurse in the first place? She might be feeling pretty jaded in this morning. Maybe she already had to fill out a bunch of paperwork for Medicare or something, and it's dispiriting. So she's already kind of down in the dumps. But just remembering, just having a sense of, oh, I remember why I became a nurse, because it's wonderful to be able to help people. And I have this gift, I have a capacity, I've studied, I have skills that I have learned, and I can diagnose someone, I can help them, I can be empathic with them, I can actually help them, and I can help the family too. So now, that's a huge difference in the first example I gave. And now she attunes to herself quickly. What's her embodied experience? What's she feeling? She feeling anxious or fearful? What's her story? Gee, I don't know if I could. This is a 5-year-old with cancer. This is horrible. I don't know what I don't know if I can be helpful. And then she attunes to the child. What's his embodied experience? What's he feeling? This 5-year-old. What's his story? What's he telling himself? And then she quickly sizes up the situation. What can she do in 15 minutes? And then she engages with the child, perhaps she engages with the family. And when she's done, when the 15 minutes are up, she's got to walk out of that room and close the door. She may not feel like she got a lot done. She did the best she could in 15 minutes with what she had to work with. And she's got to close that door so that she can go and see the next patient and not bring in all the, if she's upregulated, you don't want to bring that in to the next patient. That is not so easy to do. She's just experienced a 5-year-old with cancer. Who among us can actually be present at that kind of suffering and close the door and move on to the next, possibly equally horrific and suffering taking place in the next waiting room. So that is why Joan Halifax Roshi developed this process for palliative care and healthcare workers, but it actually applies to, I think, anyone in any relationship. Imagine some of you are parents and have teenagers who are maybe becoming feral at this point during the pandemic and are wild. I think the grace process could really help you as a parent. And if you have to go to work and you have a coworker that just drives you up the wall, part of the skill that we learn in the grace process is how easily we can be triggered by suffering. And this is really important to appreciate, because a lot of people go into healthcare because they have big hearts. They want to help people. And I've seen a lot of healthcare workers that are burnt out, that have big hearts. So if you try to bear witness to suffering and you have all this empathy for the suffering, but you do it without a clear intention, you're raising the possibility that you're much more likely to be what they call in neuroscience, be upregulated or triggered by that suffering. And once you're triggered, then you're not going to be as skillful in working with the patient. And not only that, but you're also more likely to feel more stress. And if this happens over time, you actually may experience burnout, and you might not even know it. So the point here, and I realize this sounds like I'm making an extravagant promise. I don't mean that this could happen 100% of the time, but I mean that when we do a process like grace, where we put together these non-compassionate elements like attention and intention and embodiment and some insight about the situation and about the other person, we make it much more likely that compassion will emerge in that encounter, and that compassion can really help us be resilient and can help us practice wise hope. Can help us practice being of service, taking care of ourselves as we take care of someone else. But if you don't take care of yourself, then in our tradition, we would just say you're not being skillful. It's not a judgment, it's just an observation. And the reason why I'm so enthusiastic about grace is I really do think it's like a spiritual technology. We need to learn, if you're a long-term practitioner, you begin to develop, hopefully, compassion as a trait of your character. But we need skills like grace to handle our daily lives, where we encounter stressful situations, where we're working with a patient, a client, maybe one of our parents is sick. I know many of you are struggling with people in your family being seriously ill. How do you be of service in that situation? How do you show up? Because if you don't show up, you can't be of service. You could just hide, you could deny that it's happening. That's one strategy, but it's not going to be very helpful for your family. So how do you show up? And I think the grace process is a beautiful upaya that can help us practice making it more likely that we will be able to regulate ourselves and balance ourselves and be grounded in the midst of extreme suffering. And that's really, I think, when we talk about bearing witness, that's what we're trying to do. Let's not idealize this. We don't do it perfectly. We all, get triggered. So an upaya, skillful mean, is something that we can practice, and we can get better at it by practicing it. So that's I don't want to go in, that's the grace process, essentially. And I just want to reiterate that I think we really don't appreciate how how strong compassion is, how resilient compassion is. And it's the heart of our Zen tradition. It's the heart of the vows that we take as bodhisattvas. And it's how wisdom functions in the world. And at a time like this, when we easily become dulled down, distracted, dispirited, it's important we are very fortunate if we have a Bodhisattva vow to orient our lives around, because it can help you show up. And the world needs you to show up. It needs all of us to show up. So that's my talk for this morning. I'd be happy to have some discussion, or questions, or conversation about this. Maybe you have some stories to share. Robert?
I went through the forgiveness workshop where we did grace last year or maybe a little before.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention that, it kind of comes up in the caregiving context because I think that's Roshi Joan Halifax's background professionally. But I've used that in just any difficult interpersonal situation. I think it's kind of a gold mine. And I think it can be broadened to just almost any difficult or challenging interpersonal situation. I think it's really a good example to use it in these difficult care situations, but it doesn't have to be ratcheted up that high.
No, not at all. You could come up with working with your students or working with a colleague or anybody. Yes, I agree. I think it can be used in any relational situation. The point is to realize that compassion isn't just some place in our brain that we strengthen, that compassion is an emergent process that arises when we put together a sequence of skills, non-compassionate skills that then make it more likely that it arises. And I think that's a brilliant discovery by Joan Halifax Roshi, that I've never heard compassion taught in that way before. I've always heard it more or less as a kind of somewhat of a moralistic teaching that comes from religions, which I don't think is helpful at all, because it doesn't give you any precise way to actually practice the compassion. Yeah, thank you, Robert. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Roshi. This is wonderful. I'm working in the hospital on some days in the week, and lately when you see people in there, they look like zombies. They're gone.
Yeah.
They're just like barely there. And that's people that are seeing patients and people that are not seeing patients. And when you're up on the floors, there's all this crazy stuff of, don't go in this room unless you have all this stuff on, and don't go here unless, so there's all these like layers, and people don't even know they're burned out. So how do you even bring that awareness?
Well, that's a problem. I think when we're burnt out, we don't even know it often. Encourage people to take the grace workshop if they're willing to consider trying something new. But yeah, I get that. I remember after 9/11 being in an airport, it's like being in a mausoleum. Everyone is shut down. So that's a natural reaction to too much suffering. When we get upregulated and stressed out, more than stressed out, it's really what burnout is, the nature of burnout. And it's of epidemic proportions right now. So I think the first thing is just to have an awareness of it, and then ways that we can find to be kind, to talk to people about it, that we might be able to help them have more awareness of it, and begin to address it in some way that's constructive. Thank you, Shinko.
Morning, Roshi.
Shishin?
Morning. I think Mark and Kathy were going to jump in ahead of me. I'll wait for them.
I'm happy to have you go ahead, Mark.
Okay. Thank you, Roshi, very much. A couple of things that I thought about during this, and I'm triggered by the word trigger. I think that the grace process is a wonderful process, especially when you know it, to catch yourself in the middle of being triggered. So that so often, you know, we're in not necessarily conflictual situations. We're just in some maybe moral dilemmas. And we're having a conversation, and then or we're seeing something, perhaps even something on the street, like the people who observed poor George Floyd being murdered. They were in a moral dilemma. If they had taken the grace training, hypothetically, any of them, they being triggered by that, they could also have perhaps found some ways to engage with the police in a more meaningful way, and perhaps even stop that. Who knows? I mean, this is all of my fantasy right now, but I'm just talking really about being triggered and finding your way within the grace process to suddenly then, okay, taking a breath, attuning to yourself and perhaps the others, and considering what will serve, maybe saying nothing, or maybe calling out, maybe asking a question. So I think,
Yeah.
I think that's all I need to say, and thank you so much for making me think about it this way.
No, thank you, Shishin. And I think the part of the point here is it even though we present it as a linear sequence of things, it doesn't. When we practice it, it may not happen. You may not start with awareness. You might start with being triggered, and then you have some awareness of being triggered, which allows you then to bring in aspects of the process that could be helpful.
Yes, I think they're totally interdependent.
Yeah.
All five.
Yeah. You know, we have the story in the Zen, a koan in the Zen tradition of where Nansen walks into the monastery, and the two sides of the monastery are arguing about a cat. And so he grabs the cat and holds it up and says, if anyone can say anything, I'll spare the cat. But they couldn't say anything. They were so invested in their particular point of view of being right or saying something that was clever and Zen-like that they were tongue-tied. And it's said that he cut the cat in two. We don't know if he actually did that, but that's the story. And it's kind of the same thing. When we're in a situation where there's a moral dilemma, how do we find the resources to respond? Yeah. Thank you. I also I know that Mark and Pat and Chris have all studied the grace process as well with Joan Halifax Roshi and have taught it here at the Zen Center. So we have other resources here at the Zen Center of people that have skills in practicing this as well.
I also was going to pick up on the point about triggering or being triggered by suffering. And as a parent, I certainly think it speaks to that in some ways where some aspects biological, probably psychological, where a child has suffering and it draws the attention away from other things, which then triggers a whole set of routines, both some more conscious, some more subconscious, even a routine at one's attention having been on something else, being frustrated by being drawn to the attention of that suffering. And so I just found that it's hard in the moment. I think it's true for all of these, but hard in the moment to step back and sort of go, okay, what's the immediate situation? How do I add? How do I help in skill development? How do I help my own? What skills do I need to be working on to help with the skill development? And so there's a lot there that I found particularly helpful to start thinking about. So thank you, Roshi, for that.
Yeah, Mark. I think again, what Shishin was saying is really important. That the first thing you may be aware of is being triggered. That may be the first thing that arises in your awareness in the situation, and then you have to work backward from there, or forward, whatever. You have to work with that. But having an awareness that you've been triggered is important. It's important to know that you've been upregulated and that you're probably a little out of balance at the moment. And at that point, you could take steps to pause or just step back from the situation for a moment and have some, instead of trying to just work with the other person, your child or your teenager, actually take a moment to pause and pay attention to yourself. Yeah, have some awareness that you've been triggered, and you probably aren't going to have a very keen meta awareness of your child at that moment because you're sort of caught up in the being triggered. So then you work with so again, I think that's really an important point, that this process comes wherever it comes, and then we can enter into it. Yeah. Yeah, I don't have kids, but I can imagine. And I always tell the story that June and me were out walking at the beginning of the pandemic last year. I think it was around April. And we were having a conversation. We were wondering what it was like for parents with kids, what it was like. And we came upon this house in Oak Park that had a sign in their living room window that said, 3 kids for sale. And that said everything. Like, oh, okay. Challenging to be a parent in a pandemic. I can imagine how difficult it is to homeschool your kids, and they're running around the house, and you're all in the same space together. That could be really challenging. Yeah, Barb.
So of course, I'm always struck with Grace about how much it's embodied in mindful conflict resolution and prevention, and being able to sit in the presence and then train people in it without calling it grace or spiritual technology, and watch it really do its magic. I've worked with teams who have really matriculated that into their meetings and how they do things, and it seems very, very skillful when they're up to it. But I want to pick up on what Lori was saying, that there is so much burnout. I mean, there's burnout amongst all helpers right now, I think, and I find that just applying grace, again, remembering that there's not an outcome. So sometimes just seeing if they can see my eyes and feel my heart smiling at them, requiring 0 of them, is so helpful. It can just provide one small oasis of compassion for them. And it's, so it's like grace, truncated in a way, just with that passing and being able to do that and allowing that to be what I can do, so that I don't get sucked in to my own burnout triggers. It's so important. But Lori, thank you for going through the hospital and for seeing the suffering that you're seeing and doing the work you're doing so that others can benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Barb.
If I can say one other thing, Roshi, that I thought about when Mark was just talking. Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
and that is that there are innumerable ways, I guess, that we can all be upregulated. It could be a teenager, it could be somebody in the hospital, but it could be people at work. It could be our spouse. could be our 3-year-old. It could be a homeless person on the street who's struggling. You know,
It could be
upregulation doesn't have to be from just a torrid hospital environment.
sure. Yeah, we can all get outraged watching the news and go on social media and just flame, you know, that's another kind of being upregulated. And
I wanted to also say, of course, then the process of being embodied is so important there in that attunement. And I've just been noticing myself when I sit, if I can lengthen the back of my neck, I seem to have better able to connect with my breath down to my belly. I've just been noticing that, which means I have to notice where my chin is. And then kind of, usually it's jutting out like that, right? So if I lengthen the back of my neck and just pull the chin in a little bit, I find, oh, there's my breath. And I'm embodied like that little apple there Mark Shishin has on his neck. Yeah, it's just and then I can feel my body and be embodied. It's really, I mean, I've been doing this practice for a long time. So all these little, you know, realizations that remind me still.
no, I've been reading Altered Traits all week, and one of the things they found in I forget exactly what it was, but there was some correlation between people's posture being upright or being slumped and having a kind of depressed outlook on life when you're slumped. So in Chogyam Trungpa in the Shambhala tradition, they speak about having head and shoulders, just showing up, being upright with a strong back and a soft front. That's a kind of talking about the posture as a way of being embodied. We can uplift ourselves and actually improve our disposition as a result. Yeah. But Sensei is doing some wonderful work with movement and Zen now and hula, and is doing workshops of mindful movement, which we really need. And Melanie is offering possibly to do a yoga workshop with us as well, which would be wonderful. We need movement to ground ourselves and be embodied when in this time. So anything we can do to trust this nonverbal embodied awareness is really important. Again, it's part of the key about working with being upregulated. When you're upregulated, if you just go with the story in your head or the voice in your head, you can increase the being triggered and the anxiety that may go with it. But if you can experience that as an embodied anxiety, so to speak, that's nonverbal, it's a way to begin to decrease the stress from being triggered. So maybe that's enough for this morning. I hope you're all well and safe and have gotten the vaccine or are getting it, and that your family is well and safe. And please take good care of yourselves and take care of each other. We had a wonderful social gathering a couple weeks ago in the backyard, and I look forward to seeing all of you in person at some point or another in this coming year. So thank you so much.